Hi everyone! Welcome to today's video where we'll dive into some truly chilling hospital horror stories. So get comfy, grab a warm cup of coffee, tea, or cocoa, and settle in. It's going to be a spine-tingling ride. Don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe if you enjoy these stories. Now, let's step into the shadows and get started. The Call from the Dead. It was my third month working the night shift, and I had grown used to the quiet. Hospital nights are their own kind of eerie, where even the smallest sound feels amplified in the silence. But for the past few weeks, something strange had started happening. Every night at precisely 3:33 a.m., the hospital's landline at the front desk would ring. At first, I thought it was a prank. A few of my co-workers had joked about how the witching hour could sometimes bring strange events, but I brushed it off. The first time the phone rang, I picked it up, half asleep, expecting a patient's relative or an administrative call. Instead, I was met with silence, heavy, suffocating silence, and then breathing, slow, labored breaths, raspy and irregular, as if someone was struggling to take their last. "Hello? Who's there?" I whispered, trying not to disturb the sleeping patients nearby. No response, just the same haunting, shallow breaths. I hung up, dismissing it as some technical glitch. But the calls didn't stop. Each night, exactly 3:33 a.m., I'd answer, and the same breathy silence would follow. It was unnerving, but I told myself it was someone's idea of a twisted prank. One night, I tried to ignore it, letting the phone ring. But after what felt like hours, the ringing stopped, only to start again minutes later. I gave in, answered, and this time the line wasn't silent. Along with the breathing, I heard a faint scraping sound as if something was dragging across the floor. My stomach knotted. I wanted to hang up, but something held me there, some instinct that there was more to this than a prank. The following day, I asked some of the other nurses if they'd ever gotten calls at night from the hospital line. One of the older nurses, Joan, looked at me sharply. "Is it at 3:33? She asked, her voice low. I nodded. Joan seemed visibly disturbed and finally muttered, "It's happened before." According to Joan, years ago, there had been a patient, an elderly man in his late 60s, who had come in complaining of chest pain. He was a quiet man, always alone, and rarely received visitors. One night, during Joan's shift, he passed away unexpectedly, his last breath taken in solitude. A few days after his passing, nurses started receiving phone calls in the middle of the night. At first, they thought it was his family, reaching out in grief, but when the calls continued, they realized it was something more. That night, I braced myself, knowing the call would come again. At 3:33, like clockwork, the phone rang, piercing the silence of the empty ward. Taking a deep breath, I answered. "Hello?" I said, my voice steadier than I felt. This time the breathing was louder, more ragged. And then, for the first time, I heard something else. A faint whisper. I couldn't make out the words, but the desperation was unmistakable. I strained to listen, feeling a cold chill wrap around me, and suddenly I understood. This was a call for help. Piecing together what I'd heard from Joan, I began to research the man's family, hoping to find a way to give him closure. Days of digging turned up an address, and I decided to visit his daughter. She hadn't seen him in years. But when I explained why I had come, her eyes filled with tears. She confessed she had wanted to make amends, but had been too afraid, too uncertain. Now she regretted every moment lost. That night when the phone rang at 3:33, I was ready. This time I picked up the receiver with a sense of purpose. I whispered, "She knows. She's sorry." The breathing on the other end grew quieter, less strained, and then, clear as day, a voice spoke. "Tell her I forgive her." Tell her, thank you. The line went dead, and for the first time in weeks, I didn't feel that eerie chill. I knew somehow that I wouldn't be getting any more calls, that he'd finally found the peace he was searching for. Room 303. My first month as a night shift resident was filled with the typical challenges: long hours, endless charting, and the occasional patient with an unusual story. But one thing that caught my attention immediately was the mention of Room 303. Every time I passed that room, just an old storage closet now, I felt a chill, a sensation I shrugged off at first. Then I started hearing the rumors. One night, while checking in on patients, I overheard two nurses discussing it in hushed voices. They shared stories of scratching sounds, low whispers, and a cold presence that lingered in the hallway outside 303. Patients in nearby rooms would complain of someone watching them or seeing fleeting figures from the corner of their eye. According to hospital legend, Room 303 used to house patients with severe psychological conditions. But after strange occurrences, the room had been emptied, its door locked for good. One patient, Mrs. Avery, an elderly woman with a sharp wit, mentioned it to me one night. "Doc," she said, her voice barely a whisper, "have you seen the man in Room 303? He watches me." I reassured her, but her words gnawed at me, fueling my curiosity. Who was the man, and why did so many people experience similar encounters near that room? Later that night, curiosity got the best of me. I found myself outside Room 303, the only sounds around me being the faint hum of the fluorescent lights and the distant beeping of a heart monitor down the hall. My hand shook as I reached for the door handle. To my surprise, it turned easily, as if the lock had never been there. Inside, the room was dim, cluttered with old hospital equipment and stacks of dusty boxes. But the air felt different, heavier, colder. The walls, lined with peeling wallpaper, seemed to close in as I stepped further inside. I found scattered belongings of past patients: a worn-out teddy bear, a silver locket, a pair of cracked glasses. But what caught my eye most was a handwritten letter, brittle with age, resting on the floor. The words were scrawled hastily. "They kept me locked here. No one listened. Please, someone help me." A shiver ran down my spine. As I read, the room felt alive. Shadows seemed to pulse along the walls, and the air thickened with an unnatural chill. I backed toward the door, but before I could reach it, the door swung shut with a deafening slam. Panicked, I yanked on the handle, but it wouldn't budge. The scratching noises began, soft at first, then growing louder, coming from all sides. I spun around, searching for the source, but the room was empty. Suddenly, the lights flickered, casting brief, eerie shadows that stretched and twisted. And then, in one of those flickers, I saw him. A figure, gaunt and hollow-eyed, stood just inches from me, his face twisted in anguish. His clothes were the faded white of an old hospital gown, and his skeletal hands reached toward me. His mouth opened, but instead of words, a rasping whisper filled the room. "They kept me here. No one helped." I tried to scream, but my voice caught in my throat. I yanked on the door again, desperate to escape, but it felt as if something was holding me in place. The figure stepped closer, his hand brushing my shoulder, and I felt an icy grip that chilled me to my core. He wasn't just a ghost. He was a soul seeking justice, desperate for someone to finally acknowledge his suffering. With a final surge of strength, I threw myself against the door. It flew open, and I stumbled into the hallway, gasping for air. The scratching, the whispers, everything stopped. But I knew I'd never be the same. Since that night, I've kept my distance from Room 303, but I can't shake the feeling that someone, or something, is still watching, waiting for the day someone will listen to his story. The Vanishing Patient. Working the night shift at a hospital brings its own set of strange occurrences, but for a nurse named Emily, the oddities started to go beyond the usual. She first saw him during one of her midnight rounds, a frail, elderly man sitting alone in a wheelchair down one of the dimly lit, unused hallways. His head was lowered, and his hands rested on the wheelchair arms, pale and lifeless. Something about the stillness, the silence around him, made her hesitate. She moved closer, planning to check on him. "Sir, are you all right?" she called out softly. But he didn't answer. Instead, his head remained bowed, unmoving, as if he hadn't heard her at all. She took another step, but then her pager beeped, and by the time she looked back, he was gone. Confused, she brushed it off. Hospitals are full of elderly patients. Perhaps he'd just wheeled himself back to his room. The next night, she saw him again, but this time, he was on a different floor. The same wheelchair, the same bowed head, and the same chilling silence. This time, Emily approached more quickly, calling to him, her shoes echoing against the tiled floor. Yet, as she neared him, a shiver ran down her spine. His features were wrong somehow. Hollow, gaunt, almost like he hadn't eaten in days. She called out to him, her voice more uncertain now, but before she could reach him, her name was called over the intercom for an urgent matter. When she turned around, the hallway was empty. Emily checked with the patient records, but there was no sign of any man fitting his description. She asked the other night shift nurses, and one of them paled at the mention of an elderly man in a wheelchair. "I've seen him too," she whispered. "He's always in the hallways near the rooms of those who are close to passing." Over the next few nights, the sightings grew more frequent. The man would appear in different wings, sometimes moving between the rooms of patients who, just hours later, would pass away. Other nurses began reporting the same sightings, especially near the hospice care unit. Some of them swore they heard faint murmurs, whispers that grew louder as they approached him, only to fade when they got close. Emily couldn't shake the feeling that he was guiding her, leading her deeper into the hospital each night. She followed him once, curious and slightly fearful. Her footsteps echoed around her as she trailed him through twisting hallways that seemed darker, more silent than usual. But as she rounded a corner, he disappeared once again, leaving her standing alone in an empty hallway with only the hum of the flickering lights above. She became obsessed with understanding who he was. After hours of digging through old hospital records, Emily finally uncovered a hint of his past. Decades ago, a patient fitting his description had passed away in the hospital. He was an elderly man who had been brought in alone, with no family, no friends, and no one by his side. The records didn't even have his full name, just an initial Mr. T. Dot. He had died alone late at night without anyone to comfort him. It clicked then. He was lingering in the hallways of the hospital, tied to those rooms where the patients had no one by their side, as if he were there to comfort them in their final moments. The following night, as Emily passed by the hallway where she had seen him most recently, she felt a familiar chill. Turning, she saw the wheelchair, empty at first, but within a blink, he was there, his gaunt face tilted toward her. This time, his eyes were open, fixed on her with a hollow stare. For the first time, he moved, raising one bony hand as if reaching out. Her heart pounded, and she turned and ran, unable to face him any longer. Days passed without sightings, but Emily knew he hadn't left. She could feel him watching her, lingering just at the edge of her vision. She realized with a cold clarity that he wasn't there for any of the other patients this time.